The sun peeked through the branches as Michael wiped sweat from his forehead. He stepped back to admire the young red maple he'd just planted, the newest addition to his backyard sanctuary. At 62, his hands were weathered but still strong, marked with the calluses of someone who worked the earth regularly. "There you go," he whispered to the tree, patting the soil around its base. "Welcome to your new home." Michael had moved into the Oak Ridge Estates neighborhood just 4 months ago after inheriting the modest ranch-style house from his Uncle Tom. The house itself was nothing special, a 3-bedroom from the 1980s that needed updating, but the half-acre lot was what made Michael's heart sing. It gave him room for his true passion, trees. Back when most kids were dreaming of becoming astronauts or firefighters, Michael had been the odd child who could name every tree in a local park. That passion never faded. He'd spent his career as an environmental lawyer, fighting to protect forests and green spaces from development. Now retired, he finally had time to create his own little forest. The backyard was already taking shape. Near the fence line stood 3 towering oaks that had been there for decades. Michael had added a pair of flowering dogwoods, a black cherry, and several serviceberry trees that would feed local birds. In the far corner grew a rare Franklin tree, extinct in the wild but preserved through cultivation. Each plant had been carefully chosen not just for beauty, but to create a functioning ecosystem. "Talking to your trees again," called a friendly voice. Michael looked up to see his next-door neighbor, Pete, leaning over the fence. A retired plumber in his 70s, Pete was one of the few people in the neighborhood Michael had gotten to know. "They listen better than most people," Michael replied with a grin. "Can't argue with that," Pete chuckled. "Garvin's looking good, real different from how Tom kept it." Michael nodded. His uncle had been more interested in perfectly trimmed grass than biodiversity. Change can be good. True enough, though you might want to watch yourself with all these trees. Some folks around here get fussy about that kind of thing. Fussy about trees? Michael raised an eyebrow. Pete lowered his voice. "The HOA here has been pretty relaxed for years, but I hear they've got a new president who's itching to shake things up. Name's Brenda. Moved here from some fancy gated community and thinks she needs to bring those standards with her." Michael shrugged. "I'm not worried. These trees are all properly spaced and won't damage any foundations or power lines. Besides, who could object to a few trees?" "Just giving you a heads up," Pete said. "Anyway, Linda's got dinner ready. See you around." After Pete left, Michael went back to work, spreading mulch around his newly planted trees. The evening air filled with the scent of earth and growing things. A pair of cardinals flitted between branches, and somewhere nearby, cicadas began their evening chorus. This was exactly what he dreamed of during all those years stuck in an office, poring over environmental impact statements and zoning regulations. His own little patch of wilderness, right here in suburbia. As the sun began to set, Michael sat on his back porch with a glass of iced tea, watching shadows lengthen across his budding forest. He still had so much to do. Plant the understory shrubs, add some wildflowers, maybe build a small pond. But there was no rush. Trees taught patience, if nothing else. Little did he know that his peaceful retreat was already catching unwanted attention. 3 houses down, a woman with perfectly highlighted hair and a permanent frown was peering through binoculars at what she considered an eyesore in the making. And she had just been handed the power to do something about it. Brenda Wilkins stood in front of her bathroom mirror, carefully applying another coat of bright red lipstick. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a tight bun, not a single strand out of place. She straightened the collar of her crisp white blouse and nodded at her reflection. "Perfect," she murmured. Today was important. Her first official neighborhood inspection as HOA president. After 3 years of living in Oak Ridge Estates, she'd finally gotten what she wanted: control. Brenda had moved to the neighborhood after her divorce, trading her luxury condo downtown for what she considered a stepping stone until she could afford something better. From day one, she'd been horrified by what she called the lack of standards in Oak Ridge. Kids' toys left in front yards, Christmas lights still hanging in February, and the landscaping absolutely dreadful with no uniformity whatsoever. She grabbed her clipboard from the kitchen counter and checked her watch. 9 o'clock. Perfect time to catch rule breakers in action. "Come on, precious," she called to her tiny white Pomeranian. The The dog yapped and pranced to the door, rhinestone collar glittering. "We're going to make this neighborhood respectable again." Outside, the spring morning was pleasant, birds chirping as Brenda marched down her perfectly edged driveway. Her own yard was a testament to her values, neatly trimmed boxwood shrubs in perfect rows, not a dandelion in sight on her chemically treated lawn that remained an unnatural bright green year-round. She'd prepared for this day by spending hours studying the HOA bylaws, highlighting obscure rules that hadn't been enforced in years. Rules about approved paint colors. Rules about garden ornaments. And her personal favorite, rules about vegetation height, density, and type. "Morning, Mrs. Wilkins," called an elderly gentleman watering his roses. Brenda forced a tight smile. "Good morning, Mr. Chen. I see you've added some new flowers. I hope you submitted the proper landscape modification form." The old man's smile faltered. "I've been planting these same roses for 20 years. But Brenda was already moving on, making a note on her clipboard. Behind her, she heard Mr. Chen mutter something under his breath. She didn't care. They'd all thank her when property values increased. By 11 o'clock, she'd filled 3 pages with violations. Mrs. Patterson's wind chimes, too many. The Rodriguez family's basketball hoop, technically not the approved model. The Thompsons' mailbox, half an inch taller than regulation. Then she turned the corner onto Oak Lane and stopped dead in her tracks. "What in the world is this mess?" she gasped. Across the street stood a house she hadn't visited before. The front yard was neat enough, with a simple garden, but she could see into the backyard. And what she saw made her blood boil. Trees, dozens of them. Different heights, different types, completely unorganized in her eyes. Some had branches that stretched over neighboring properties. Others were clearly not from the approved landscaping list she'd memorized. Precious yapped at her feet as if sharing her outrage. Brenda flipped through her folder to the section on approved vegetation. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she muttered. She snapped several photos with her phone, zooming in on particularly offensive specimens, a weeping willow, some kind of fruit tree with messy-looking blossoms, and several evergreens that blocked what she felt should be a clean sight line between houses. She checked her roster. The property belonged to someone named Michael Thompson, new resident. Probably had no idea about proper neighborhood standards. "Well, Mr. Thompson," she said to herself, already drafting the violation notice in her head, "you're about to get a crash course in HOA regulations." As she walked away, making furious notes, a slow smile spread across her face. This was exactly the kind of situation she'd been waiting for, a chance to make an example of someone. After all, if she could force someone to remove an entire collection of trees, the smaller violations would be easy to handle. Behind her, a cardinal landed on one of Michael's beloved trees, singing cheerfully, unaware that its perch had just been marked for destruction by a woman who measured her self-worth by the uniformity of her surroundings. Michael hummed to himself as he loaded bags of fresh produce into his car. Saturday mornings at the farmer's market had become his favorite ritual since moving to Oak Ridge. He'd spent the last 2 hours chatting with local growers, sampling honey from a nearby apiary, and picking out the perfect heirloom tomatoes. "See you next week, Michael," called the apple vendor, a weathered woman in overalls who'd been saving him the crispest Honeycrisps. "Wouldn't miss it," Michael replied with a wave, climbing into his 10-year-old Subaru. The drive home was peaceful, windows down to catch the spring breeze. Michael was thinking about the new raspberry bushes he planned to plant that afternoon. They'd attract butterflies and provide some natural privacy along the side fence. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed something fluttering on his front door. Probably a flyer for lawn care or window washing, he thought. But as he approached, grocery bags in hand, he realized it was something official-looking. A letter-sized envelope taped to the door with "Notice of Violation" printed in bold red letters. "What the heck?" he muttered, setting down his bags to pull the envelope free. Inside was a 3-page letter on Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association letterhead. Michael scanned the first paragraph, his eyebrows rising higher with each word. "This is ridiculous," he said aloud as he read about multiple landscaping violations and unauthorized arboreal specimens. The letter demanded that he remove at least 50% of his trees within 30 days or face daily fines of $100. He flipped to page 2, which included grainy photos of his backyard trees with red circles and arrows marking the offending vegetation. The final page cited bylaws about maintaining neighborhood aesthetic cohesion and preventing visual disruptions to property sightlines. At the bottom was a signature in aggressive blue ink, Brenda Wilkins, HOA President. Michael was still standing in his doorway, letter in hand, when a sharp voice called out from his driveway. "Mr. Thompson, I see you've received my notice." A woman in pressed khaki pants and a polo shirt was walking toward him, clipboard in hand and a tiny white dog at her heels. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Brenda Wilkins, president of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. I thought I should stop by personally to discuss your situation." Michael took a deep breath. "Nice to meet you, Ms. Wilkins. Though I have to say, this notice seems excessive. These trees aren't causing any problems." Brenda's smile tightened as she pushed past him into his yard, uninvited. "Let me show you exactly what's wrong here." She gestured broadly at his backyard. "These trees are completely unregulated. They drop leaves and seeds on neighboring properties. This one here blocks Mrs. Henderson's view, and none of them match the approved landscaping palette for our community." "Approved palette?" Michael asked, trying to keep his voice level. "They're native species that." Section 8, Paragraph C of the bylaws clearly states that all landscaping must conform to the approved list established in 2012, Brenda interrupted, pointing to a highlighted section on her clipboard. "None of these unusual specimens are on that list." Michael noticed she said unusual as if she was saying radioactive. "Look, Ms. Wilkins." "It's Mrs.," she corrected sharply. "Mrs. Wilkins," Michael continued patiently. "These trees provide habitat for local wildlife and actually increase property values by—" "I've been in real estate for 15 years, she cut in again, though Michael doubted that was true. "And I can assure you that unconventional landscaping like this decreases neighborhood appeal. Potential buyers want conformity and predictability." She circled his yard, pointing out each tree she found offensive, while her little dog sniffed suspiciously at Michael's prized Franklin tree. This one, and definitely this one," she said, gesturing to his oldest oak. "They'll need to go first. My brother-in-law runs a tree removal service. I'd be happy to give you his card." Michael felt his face growing warm, but he kept his voice steady. "I'll need to review the bylaws myself before making any decisions." Brenda's smile turned cold. "Of course. Review all you want. But the 30-day clock is ticking, Mr. Thompson. The board meeting is in 2 weeks if you wish to appeal, but I should warn you, the board generally follows my recommendations." With that, she turned on her heel, calling her dog to follow. "Looking forward to seeing a cleaner landscape here soon," she called over her shoulder, her voice falsely cheerful. Michael watched her go, the violation notice crumpled slightly in his grip. He looked back at his beloved trees, then down at the paper again. "We'll see about that," he murmured. After Brenda left, Michael stood in his yard for a long while, looking at his trees. The afternoon sun filtered through their leaves, creating dappled patterns on the grass. A squirrel darted up the trunk of his oak tree, chattering as if sensing the threat. "Don't worry," Michael told the squirrel. "I'm not letting anyone cut down your home." Inside, Michael cleared his kitchen table and spread out the HOA violation notice. Next to it, he placed a legal pad, then retrieved his reading glasses from the counter. If Brenda wanted to play by the rules, he'd need to know exactly what those rules were. He picked up the phone and called his neighbor Pete. "Hey Pete, it's Michael. Quick question. Do you have a copy of the complete HOA bylaws? The most current version?" "Sure do," Pete replied. "Got 'em when they tried to make me take down my bird feeders last year. Want me to bring them over?" 20 minutes later, Michael had a 3-inch binder full of Oak Ridge Estates regulations spread out beside the violation notice. Pete had stayed for a cup of coffee and to share what he knew. "Brenda's only been president for 3 weeks, Pete explained, but she's already sent out more violation notices than the previous board did in a year. Most folks are just giving in, easier than fighting." Michael nodded, flipping through pages of regulations. "Thanks for the background. I think I need to dig into this tonight." After Pete left, Michael settled in at his computer. As a former environmental lawyer, Research was second nature to him. He started with the HOA bylaws, reading every word about landscaping regulations, taking careful notes on inconsistencies and vague wording. Around midnight, with a half-empty cup of cold tea beside him, Michael found something interesting: the approved vegetation list. Brenda had mentioned was supposed to be reviewed and updated every 5 years, but the last update had been over 10 years ago. According to the bylaws themselves, the list was technically invalid. "Gotcha," he whispered. But he knew that wouldn't be enough. The next morning, Michael drove to the county office building. The clerk at the records department looked surprised when he requested copies of all local ordinances related to tree preservation and environmental protection. "That's quite a lot of material, sir," she said. Michael smiled. "I've got time." By Wednesday, his dining room had become a research center. Stacks of printouts, legal documents, and reference books covered every surface. He'd discovered that the county had passed a green spaces initiative 3 years ago that protected certain native tree species, including 5 varieties growing in his yard. He made a call to an old colleague from his law firm days. "Ray, it's Michael Thompson. Remember that case we worked on in Hartford about tree ordinances? I need to pick your brain." That evening, Michael ventured out with a digital camera, carefully photographing and documenting each tree in his yard, measuring height, diameter, and distance from property lines. He created a spreadsheet matching each tree to specific protections under various laws. On Thursday, he visited the local university's agricultural extension office, where a former student of his worked as an environmental consultant. "Professor Thompson," Lisa exclaimed when she saw him. "What brings you here?" "I need some expert opinions on the ecological value of my property," he explained. By Friday, Michael had compiled a 3-part defense. The HOA's own bylaws contained procedural errors, county and state regulations protected many of his trees, and he had expert testimony on the environmental benefits his mini-forest provided to the entire neighborhood. As he organized his findings into a presentation folder, the phone rang. It was Pete again. "Just wanted to warn you. Brenda's been going door to door asking neighbors to sign a petition about your trees. Says they're a community eyesore and a potential safety hazard during storms." Michael thanked him for the heads up and hung up, not worried. He slipped his presentation into his briefcase and checked the calendar. The HOA board meeting was Tuesday night. "Let's see how confident Mrs. Wilkins is when faced with actual facts," he said to himself, glancing out the window where a pair of cardinals were building a nest in one of his threatened maples. For the first time since receiving the violation notice, Michael smiled. Brenda had no idea what was coming. The community center buzzed with quiet conversations as Michael entered the room. Tuesday night had arrived, and with it, the monthly HOA board meeting. About 30 residents had shown up, more than usual, according to Pete, who had saved Michael a seat in the second row. "Word got around about your trees," Pete whispered. "People are curious." Michael nodded, clutching his folder of documents. He spotted Brenda at the front table, arranging papers with military precision. She wore a navy blazer with gold buttons and had her hair pulled back in her signature tight bun. When she glanced up and saw Michael, her lips thinned into a hard line. At exactly 7 o'clock, Brenda tapped a small gavel. "I call this meeting of the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association to order," she announced. "First item on tonight's agenda, property violations." Michael noticed she had changed the usual agenda order to put violations first, not subtle. "We have several compliance issues to discuss," Brenda continued, "but I'd like to begin with 47 Oak Lane." She clicked a remote, and a photo of Michael's backyard appeared on the wall screen. "As you can see, this property has an excessive number of non-approved trees, creating an unsightly and non-conforming landscape." Murmurs rippled through the room. Michael remained calm, reviewing his notes one last time. "The homeowner was issued a notice 10 days ago," Brenda continued, "requiring removal of at least 50% of these trees within 30 days. She glanced at Michael with a tight smile. "I understand Mr. Thompson wishes to appeal this decision." "That's correct," Michael said, standing. "You'll have 5 minutes to state your case," Brenda said, starting a timer on her phone. "Then the board will vote." Michael walked to the front of the room, setting his folder on the podium. He looked around at the 5 board members seated at the table, then at his neighbors in the audience. "Good evening," he began. "My name is Michael Thompson. I moved to Oak Ridge Estates 4 months ago after inheriting my uncle's property. I'm here tonight because I received a notice ordering me to remove trees that I've carefully selected and maintained." He opened his folder and pulled out the first document. "Before I address the specific complaint, I'd like to introduce myself properly. For the past 30 years, I worked as an environmental attorney specializing in land use and conservation law." He paused, noting how Brenda's smile faltered slightly. "In fact, I helped draft several of the county's current tree protection ordinances before my retirement last year." The room fell completely silent. A board member with gray hair and glasses leaned forward with sudden interest. "Now, regarding my trees," Michael continued, clicking to a new slide showing a map of his property. "I've documented each tree on my lot. Of the 23 trees in question, 14 are protected species under County Ordinance 15B, which I've included copies of for the board." He handed out packets to each board member. Brenda's face had begun to redden. "Furthermore," Michael continued, "the HOA's own bylaws state that the landscaping guidelines must be updated every 5 years. The last update was in 2012, making the current approved vegetation list invalid according to your own regulations." The gray-haired board member adjusted his glasses, frowning as he flipped through Michael's packet. "Is this correct, Mrs. Wilkins? When was the vegetation list last updated?" Brenda shuffled through her papers. "That's not relevant to the current violation." "With respect," Michael said calmly, "it's entirely relevant. You can't enforce a regulation that, according to your own bylaws, is expired." A woman in the 3rd row raised her hand. "I've been wanting to plant native species in my yard too. Are you saying the HOA can't stop me?" Before Brenda could answer, the gray-haired man spoke again. "Mrs. Wilkins, did the full board approve this violation notice before it was sent?" Brenda's face grew redder. "As president, I have the authority to." Section 3, Paragraph 2 of the bylaws requires board majority approval for all violation notices, Michael noted, pointing to the relevant page in his handout. The room erupted with whispers. A heavy-set man in a golf shirt stood up from the audience. "While we're at it, I'd like to know why Brenda told me I need to use her brother-in-law's company to replace my fence. Seems like a conflict of interest." Michael watched as the tide turned. He hadn't even gotten to his strongest arguments yet, but he could already see in the board members' faces that they were reconsidering Brenda's violation notice. And from the growing anger in Brenda's eyes, she knew it too. Brenda slapped her hand on the table. "This is completely out of order." Her voice had risen an octave. "We're discussing Mr. Thompson's violation, not my brother-in-law's business." The gray-haired board member, whom Michael had learned was Bob Wilson, the HOA treasurer, cleared his throat. "Actually, I think we need to address both issues. Mrs. Wilkins, did you authorize tree removal services before the board voted on this violation?" "I simply provided options to help Mr. Thompson comply," Brenda snapped. Her perfect bun was coming loose, with strands of hair falling around her flushed face. "That's not how I remember it," Michael said quietly. "You specifically told me which trees needed to go first and offered your brother-in-law's services in the same breath." A woman board member with short curly hair leaned toward her microphone. "Brenda, we've talked about this. Board members can't profit from enforcement actions. It's in the ethics guidelines we all signed." "I wasn't profiting." Brenda's voice cracked. "Frank's company offers the best rates in the county." The heavy-set man who had spoken up earlier laughed. "Yeah, right. He quoted me double what I paid the company I eventually used." More voices joined in, sharing similar experiences. Michael stood quietly at the podium, watching as years of Brenda's high-handed tactics came back to haunt her. He almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Bob Wilson raised his hands for quiet. "Let's get back to the matter at hand. Mr. Thompson, please continue your appeal." Michael nodded. "Thank you. I'd like to share some photos." He connected his phone to the room's display system. "These show the ecosystem my trees support." The screen filled with images of birds nesting, butterflies on flowering branches, and the dappled shade where woodland flowers grew. "My property serves as a mini wildlife sanctuary." According to Professor Lisa Chen at the university's Environmental Science Department, he held up a formal letter on university letterhead. These trees provide essential habitat for 12 bird species and numerous pollinators that benefit everyone's gardens. An older woman in the front row nodded enthusiastically. I've noticed more songbirds in the neighborhood lately. That's your doing? Michael smiled. Partly yes. Native trees support native wildlife. Well, I think it's lovely, she said, giving Brenda a challenging look. The aesthetic preferences of one person shouldn't override environmental benefits for the entire community, Michael continued, especially when those preferences have no basis in properly established regulations. I have one more question, Bob said, studying the documents Michael had provided. This county ordinance protecting native trees, it mentions that removing protected species without permits could result in fines to the property owner and, he adjusted his glasses, to any organization that ordered such removal. The implication hung in the air. If the HOA had forced Michael to cut down protected trees, they could have faced significant fines. Brenda's face had gone from red to pale. I wasn't aware of any county ordinances superseding our HOA guidelines. Ignorance of the law is no excuse, an older man called from the back of the room, triggering laughter. Bold conferred quietly with the other board members, then cleared his throat. I think we've had enough. I move that we vote on rescinding the violation notice issued to Mr. Thompson. Seconded, said the curly-haired woman quickly. All in favor? Bob asked. 4 hands went up immediately. Only Brenda kept her hand down, her lips pressed into a thin line. Motion carries, Bob announced. Mr. Thompson, your violation notice is rescinded, effective immediately. Applause broke out around the room. Several neighbors stood up, smiling and nodding at Michael. Brenda slammed her folder shut. This meeting isn't over. We have other violations to discuss. But people were already getting up, forming a small crowd around Michael to ask questions about his trees and compliment his presentation. You can't just ignore the other items on the agenda. Brenda's voice rose above the chatter. This is completely unprofessional. Bob touched her arm. Brenda, we need to talk about your position as board president, given the conflict of interest that's come to light. Conflict of interest? She jerked her arm away. I've given everything to this neighborhood. I've worked tirelessly to maintain standards while all of you let things slide. Michael watched as Brenda's carefully constructed authority crumbled before his eyes. He hadn't come looking for revenge, just to protect his trees. But as he observed her desperate attempts to regain control, he realized this was about much more than landscaping rules. It was about power and who got to decide what mattered in a community. 2 weeks after the dramatic board meeting, Michael sat on his back porch with a cup of coffee, watching a family of robins splash in his new bird bath. The morning air was sweet with the scent of flowering dogwoods. His phone buzzed with a text from Pate. Have you seen the newsletter? Michael hadn't. He went inside and found the neighborhood email, opening the attachment. There it was on the front page. Board announces leadership change. The article explained that Brenda had stepped down to pursue other interests, and Bob Wilson would serve as interim president until the next election. Michael smiled to himself. He hadn't attended the emergency board meeting where this decision was made, but Pete had filled him in on the details. After investigating further, they discovered Brenda had been selectively enforcing rules against people she disliked while ignoring violations by her friends. The brother-in-law's company had received thousands of dollars in HOA-directed business over the past year alone. The doorbell rang, interrupting his thoughts. When Michael opened the door, he was surprised to find Bob Wilson standing there, along with the curly-haired woman from the board, whose name he now knew was Diane. Morning, Michael, Bob said. Got a minute to chat? Michael invited them in, offering coffee which they'd both accepted. Once settled in the living room, Bob got straight to the point. We've been doing some thinking since the meeting. The whole tree situation made us realize how outdated our HOA guidelines are, especially around landscaping. Diane nodded. The truth is, more people are interested in environmentally friendly yards these days. Native plants, wildlife habitats, that sort of thing. We're forming a committee to revise the guidelines, Bob continued. We'd like you to head it up, given your expertise. Michael was taken aback. That's unexpected. I'm not exactly the HOA type. Diane laughed. That's exactly why we need you. Too many rules created by people who care more about property values than actual quality of life. Michael considered it. He'd spent his career fighting against unreasonable restrictions on land use. Maybe this was a chance to create something positive from the inside. I'll do it on one condition, he said. I'd like to organize a neighborhood workshop first. Show people what's possible with native landscaping, get their input before we draft new rules. Bob and Diane exchanged pleased looks. Sounds perfect, Bob said. The first workshop was held the following Saturday in Michael's backyard. He'd expected maybe a dozen people to show up, but nearly 40 neighbors arrived, curious about his trees and gardens. Michael led tours in small groups, explaining how each plant supported local wildlife and required less water and maintenance than traditional lawns. Kids were delighted by the butterfly garden, and several older residents appreciated the shade gardens that needed minimal upkeep. I had no idea native plants could look so intentional, admitted a woman who lived down the street. I always thought natural meant messy. Even more surprising was who showed up at the second workshop a month later. Michael was explaining the benefits of rain gardens when he spotted a familiar blonde bob at the back of the group. Brenda stood with arms crossed, listening silently. After others had left, she approached him awkwardly. Your yard does look nicer than I initially thought, she said, as close to an apology as she seemed capable of offering. Michael nodded. Thanks for coming. Would you like to see the flowering shrubs we just planted? 6 months later, the new landscaping guidelines were approved unanimously by the HOA. They encouraged native plants, limited chemical use, and provided resources for residents interested in wildlife-friendly yards. Several neighbors had already begun converting portions of their lawns to native gardens, creating a network of mini habitats throughout Oak Ridge estates. On a crisp fall morning, Michael stood in his front yard adjusting a new sign that read Certified Wildlife Habitat. The maple trees were turning brilliant shades of red and gold, and chickadees called from the branches. Across the street, Brenda was planting bulbs along her front walk. She'd replaced half her perfectly manicured lawn with a small native meadow, though she still kept the other half neatly trimmed. Baby steps. Morning, Brenda, Michael called. She straightened up, brushing dirt from her hands, and gave him a small but genuine smile. Morning, Michael. Your trees look beautiful today. And in that simple exchange, Michael found something he hadn't expected from his battle with the HOA, not just victory, but real, lasting change in his community.